The process is not a flow chart. It's not a box on a piece of paper that goes into a drawer and gathers dust. Your process is your series of tasks.
Yes.
And that series of tasks takes inputs and transforms them into outputs.
Welcome to Process Pioneers, the show that takes a deep dive into the minds of decision makers, key influencers, and process experts who are pioneering the world of everything process.
Welcome to another episode of Process Pioneers. My name is Daniel Rayner. I'm the host of Process Pioneers. In each of these episodes, I have the absolute privilege to sit down with different BPM practitioners, whether they work internally at an organization, whether they're coming in as an external consultant, whether it's researchers or academics. We're talking with various people from the world of business process management. How are organizations putting BPM into practice to see real commercial value for their organization? And today I have the absolute privilege of sitting down with Gary Talbot. He is the founder and principal consultant at ImproveAbility and has held various senior leadership roles around process at organizations such as NBN and Vodafone Australia. Gary, thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you very much.
So what we might do to begin is I'll pass the ball off to you to give the audience a wider or greater understanding of your background and your experience. And maybe if you can take us back to, day one of where process first piqued your interest and what happened.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. So without giving away my age, I've been doing process, as you described it, for well over 20 years. A qualified accountant who moved into project accountancy whilst working in an engineering company.
Right.
That engineering company in the early 2000s picked up Lean Six Sigma as a philosophy and a program. And I became a Lean Six Sigma black belt. And that's when I realized as an accountant, you always have to try and get it right. As a Lean Six Sigma practitioner, you have to work out how to get it wrong, to kind of work out what's going on. And my career has now moved through senior leadership roles where I always carry the toolbox of Lean, Six Sigma, change, agile, whatever is needed to solve the problems in front of me. And I don't call myself a BPM practitioner. I call myself a problem solver.
Right.
And I'm pretty agnostic about the different toolkits available to me. I started back in the early 2000s around the Lean Six Sigma as a black belt. Whilst working in engineering, I delivered process changes on the shop floor. And this was the time of the second Iraq war. And one of my more significant projects was we refurbished the gearboxes of one of the American Army's fighting machines.
Right.
And we worked out under one of my projects how to double the throughput of those gearboxes. These gearboxes came in with sand and bullets and all sorts of bizarre stuff in them. And the Army wanted them back as fast as possible. And that was probably one of my first major successes as a Lean Six Sigma black belt type person.
Right.
I then moved into other roles in retail. Mm-hmm. One of the largest supermarket groups in the UK and Europe, Tesco's. Mm-hmm. And I actually delivered a project where they had returns and refunds of an item every single year for 3 years that was faulty.
Right.
And they couldn't understand why they had all these returns. I got into it, worked out that their quality measurement system wasn't right.
Right.
Changed their quality measurement system. And it took me 2 weeks, including dealing with a Hong Kong supply chain group. Mm-hmm. And that item was never returned. There was no callbacks for about 2 years afterwards, to my knowledge.
Wow.
And then my career kind of moved into financial services. And in financial services, I was now a senior leader of 400 people in the UK. And that group of 400 people had a senior leader with a problem-solving toolkit. And that problem-solving toolkit turned that 400 group into Team of the Year. They won new clients, new business. And that's where this whole business process management, as the phrase that we kind of want to call, became very, very real.
Right.
And that was probably one of my more significant roles that I still remember the most.
Yes.
And I still talk to those guys on LinkedIn every month, looking at their achievements as they get older and wiser. Came to Australia nearly 9 years ago, joined Vodafone. So for those of you who are familiar, 9 years ago, Vodafone was Vodafail. Unfortunately, as an organization, it had completely underestimated the new iPhone and the powers needed in their network for the new iPhone.
Right.
Spent 3-4 years at Vodafone as a Six Sigma Master Black Belt, helping their team solve the whole of their network. And for those of you who are kind of impartial around the different telco providers, today, arguably, Vodafone has one of the best metro receptions of all of the different providers. Almost as good as Telstra, if not better, and better than Optus.
Yeah, right.
And I was one of those developing that. Moved into NBN. I was a general manager at NBN in their IT group. Again, senior leadership position with a toolkit of problem solving.
Yes.
Left there a few years ago, have my own consulting business. And in the last 3 years, I've consulted into some of the largest banks in Australia. And currently I am in one of them, delivering some pretty significant pieces of work. I started during COVID. I've been into the office once to pick up a laptop. I've met only some of my colleagues at a Christmas party last week for the very first time. But we're still going and we're still fixing stuff. So that's kind of me as a problem solver.
Yes, right. That's great. Now, speaking of COVID, obviously it's been a very turbulent year for a lot of organizations, and some organizations were more prepared than others, if you could say it like that. So talk to us about, I guess, the year that we have been through and how, having worked with this bank and I guess you're probably noticing in the general sort of wider business community how different organizations have adapted or failed to adapt. But talk to us about how, I guess, process has played a part in organizations navigating this turbulent year.
Yeah, so when I have this conversation with senior leaders, I often need to work through what is the definition of a process.
Right.
Because a process is not a flow chart. It's not a box on a piece of paper that goes into a drawer and gathers dust.
Yes.
Your process is your series of tasks.
Yes.
And that series of tasks takes inputs and transforms them into outputs.
Right.
When you talk to senior leaders in that kind of language, what COVID did was first of all, if your customer facing processes were very manual and very physical, you were in trouble straight away.
Right.
Yeah, if you weren't digitized, you weren't online, then you were in a lot of trouble. And many of the organizations in Australia, they fell over because they had not digitized correctly. And a number of the organizations that tried digitizing failed because their processes were not well understood.
Right.
And it is impossible to automate a manual process if it's complicated.
Yes.
It needs to be simple in the first place.
Yes, right.
And what a number of the other organizations learned, such as some of the big banks where I'm working, was what COVID did was it stress tested their processes beyond any of their expectations or imagination.
Right.
And what is now happening is, whilst there was a crisis in industry in March, April, May, those and many projects, whether they were process, whether they were customer experience, whatever they were all cancelled. Now those organizations are going, okay, hang on, we've got to now fix these significant broken processes. And what I'm finding, talking to some of the big players in Australia and Europe, is that they are looking for problem solvers who can come in very pragmatically, understand that this isn't a process, this is the way they do business. This is how their customers pay them. This is how they pay their employees' payroll.
Yes.
We might call it a process. They're calling it an experience or a journey of some description.
Right.
Put it in those phrases and then make it as an efficient, as simple as possible. Then automate it and digitize it. And in Australia, there's a bunch of these businesses that are just starting to wake up to the processes don't work. How are we going to make them work?
Yes. That's great. And I think that's a really important point there when talking to these organizations, is to speak their language. You know, they may not be using the terminology business process management, for example. And for some of them, they may have even had a negative experience when it comes to business process management. Maybe they did try to document their processes 3, 5, 10 years ago, and it just kind of sat there. They didn't have any bigger purpose or bigger why behind it. So it just sat there collecting dust, as you mentioned before.
Yeah.
And so they've been burnt by it. So if you go in there trying to use that terminology that they have a negative connotation towards, you're not going to get anywhere. You need to, speak their language, use the words that they would understand. You still might be helping them to manage their processes, but just wording it in a different way.
Absolutely. If you are not talking the language that they understand, if you're not in the what's in it for me, the WIFM, for that senior leader that you're talking to, you've missed an opportunity.
Yes.
And these senior leaders are trying to solve problems.
Yes.
They're trying to enable their customers to get through to the call center faster. They are trying to prevent stockouts. They are trying to prevent payment failures. These are the things they're trying to fix. There's a broken process behind it somewhere that needs fixing, replacing, or automating.
Yes.
And when you then link this to those leaders, how does it link to their strategy? If your strategy is, we want to be the best airline in the world, or we want to be the best department store in Australia,
right,
you have to absolutely make sure that what you're fixing enables that.
Right.
There was a recent retail survey that came out that in Australia that said about 72% of customers will not return to a retailer if they've had a bad experience in their store or online.
Right.
This is the time for problem solvers to be able to understand what the organization's problems are, that those senior execs need fixing, so that they're not the retailers that apply to that 72%.
Yes, yes.
And probably one of the things I've noticed in COVID, my tolerance for things going wrong online is even worse than it was when it started.
Right, right.
Because the only way you're talking to me is online. The only way you and I are talking is online.
Yes, yes.
We're not going to go to the pub and catch up, or the coffee shop. We're going to be talking online. It has to be seamless and it has to be correct.
Yes, yes, that's right. Now, you mentioned just before about how your processes must tie into the overall strategy. There must be that link there, that connection between what's happening in the finer details. What are the frontline employees doing, and how is that benefiting the overall strategy? Because that's the level of the business that the executives are concerned about and focused on. So tell us, or talk to us about how process does tie into strategy.
Yeah. So in today's COVID times, organizations are having to prioritize.
Right.
They're having to prioritize what their people do. They're having to prioritize what they spend their resources on. And if you're spending time and money and resources on something that isn't linked to your strategy, it's probably not going to happen.
Right.
So therefore, your process work, whatever it is, whether it's problem-solving projects, whether it's defining your processes, cataloging your processes, if they are not very easily linked to the success factors of your strategic objectives, they're not going to fly.
Right.
And some of the best organizations have something like Hoshin Kanri in place, where you can see from your top level corporate goals at the 5-year level through to the 1-year level, how that feeds down, and then what process work is providing levers to improve those projects or those goals or those initiatives.
Right. That's great. And you also mentioned before about, this idea of simplifying your processes before automating. And I think that's a very interesting point, and one I'd like to touch on, because I think organizations do dive at new technologies, whatever it might be. If they hear it's working for another organization, they're tempted to just throw it into their organization, maybe without the enough sort of pre-planning or preparation. But on the topic of automation, talk to us about, I guess, the importance behind simplifying your processes before beginning to automate. Yeah,
look, the statistics on IT projects are not great. So we all know that more IT projects fail than succeed.
Right.
And the ones that I think it was something like IBM only has 24% of its projects that end up being on schedule, on cost, and the right quality.
Wow.
And if big organizations like IBM are getting that so wrong, then the rest of us are in a lot of trouble. And what I'm finding is the language of your technology groups. Technology is now constrained. They don't have enough people. They don't have enough time. Their demand on technology through COVID has never been higher.
Right.
Organizations needed to switch off their traditional networks, move them into the cloud, enable thousands, hundreds of thousands, if not millions, to work from home within days and weeks. And they did that because they took a simple view of the problem and a simple view of the solution.
Yes.
In the bank I'm working in at the moment, we don't automate anything now until we've had a process review that says this process is simple enough, therefore automation is cheaper and more reliable with less risk, or it's a really complex process, we don't quite understand all the business rules. There's a highly likelihood that when we automate it, we're going to get it wrong.
Right.
And in an environment where automation resources are scarce, you're going to bet the ones where you got a better chance of getting it right.
Yes, right.
And the simplification agenda is often, you hear some of the big organizations, they used to talk agile. They said, we've got an agile program. You don't hear that so much now. You might hear them talk about a simplification program. Right. And that simplification program underpins whether it's process improvement, process simplification, and then automation on top of that when needed.
Yes, right. And now we've talked about a couple of various things or challenges that an organization might face when trying to, I guess, manage and improve their business processes. But is there, I guess, what are some of the biggest challenges that an organization faces when they are adopting business process management? And I understand that every organization is different, and one organization might have a fantastic culture, another organization might have fantastic leadership, and have different strengths and qualities. But generally, what do you see as one of the biggest challenges an organization faces when adopting BPM?
Yeah, so we've touched across a couple of the key topics already. First
Yes.
of all, what's in it for me?
Right.
As a senior exec, what am I getting? Yeah, I don't want flowcharts that I can't use.
Mm.
I don't want problems solved that aren't my most biggest problems that I've got.
Yes.
I don't really care whether it's ProSci, Agile, Safe, Lean Six Sigma. That's kind of the badges that you wear. What I want is, what are the tools that are applicable for the problems that I've got?
Yes.
And I think the biggest problem for BPM is it stands up as a badge. It's a label.
Right.
I'm a BPM practitioner. I am an agile practitioner. I am a ProSci practitioner. So what?
Right.
Why is that relevant? Well, actually, no, your processes need a lot of work because the regulators say so. Okay, now you've got my attention.
Right. Right.
You have a culture that's change adverse. Okay, now you've got my attention. Turn
Right.
it into the language that is going to make those senior leaders look successful, as opposed to the badges that we've been taught and
Yes.
the badges
Right.
that we've learned. Yeah.
That's good. That's great. And now talking about, I guess, the value that business process management can bring an organization. And you touched on one there briefly, like regulators and understanding your processes for audits and things like that. But is there one, I guess, specific example that comes to mind where an organization has implemented business process management, and whether that looks like a radical innovation of how they deliver value, or whether it was an incremental process improvement that equally delivered a lot of value? Do you have an example that comes to mind that you could share with myself and the audience?
So let me talk about Vodafone Australia.
Great.
Vodafone Australia 9 years ago, in a lot of trouble. It had gone from 8 million customers to 5.
Wow.
It lost millions of customers.
Wow.
And the CEO brought in a guy called Bill Morrow. So many of your viewers may have heard of Bill Morrow.
Yes.
The white-haired Californian, as we used to call him. Bill realized that one of the fundamental problems in Vodafone Australia was accountability.
Right.
And who was accountable for certain tasks, because he didn't know who to go to support them, to improve what they needed improving, or to challenge someone when it went wrong.
Right.
And what Vodafone Australia decided to do was bring in process maturity.
Right.
So process maturity, kind of as defined by Gartner, for those of you who are kind of familiar with it, 5 levels of maturity. And Vodafone Australia gave itself a target of between 3 and 4 out of 5 in 2 years.
Right.
That galvanized, I'm now interested in processes, because the CEO is, the C-suite is, and part of my bonus now relates to process.
Right.
And I was in the business excellence team then. We spent a lot of time educating, building processes, and that laid the foundation for that organization to start recovering.
Right.
It was off solving its product, building its 4G towers that just couldn't cope before, but it realigned itself as an organization into something that related to its customers as opposed to its internal hierarchy.
Right.
And most of processes today, when you look at the process hierarchy, you can almost change the title and change it for organization hierarchy.
Right. Right.
And that is not how processes work. Our customers don't go through the kind of silos that we've built our organizations as. They go through an end-to-end journey. And what that piece of work did, there was probably about 12 of us as a BPE experts, so a decent team. That helped transform that organization.
That's amazing. That's great. And obviously, like, it's when you do have that support from that executive level, it's quite easy, I guess, to for the organization to effectively implement business process management. But let's just say there's someone listening right now, and there probably will be someone that's listening that they're from a large organization that doesn't value process understanding or process management or a process centric way of delivering value, understanding that end-to-end cross-functional view of an organization. How does someone go about presenting business process management to the executive level, for example? And you've mentioned before what's in it for them. How do you speak their language? How do you talk to that level? But what is in it for them, and what should they be hearing? What do they want to hear? What do they need to hear?
Yeah, so two things. First of all, don't call it BPM.
Right.
Call it something that relates.
Yes.
Whether it's problem solving, improving efficiency, reducing customer complaints, whatever those failure modes of affected the failure modes are, turn it into that type of language. Mm. And then secondly, too many practitioners are all about the hard skills.
Right.
They're all about I can use the tool in the best way. I'm up to date with the most efficient piece of software. But the soft skills of those practitioners is not good enough to be able to go and talk to that senior exec, listen to what's important to them, and be able to discuss and influence them. Right. And often what I find is senior execs are scared of change because change has often been implemented badly. Right. And they've worn that. So one of the things I would talk to those senior execs about, well, let's shrink the change. Mm-hmm. Are you familiar with the book called Switch?
Right.
If your listeners aren't, have a look at it. Go and have a look at that. And if you're not a good influencer of senior stakeholders, then that you've just identified a development need for you as a BPM practitioner. Right. Because you should be able to go in and influence those senior stakeholders in a way that is meaningful to them. So one of the other things to recommend is BPM practitioners have a look at NLP. Have a look at neuralistic programming and go, that's interesting. If I was able to have that amount of effective communication, I would be able to talk to those senior execs in a different way. You may not persuade them because they have differing priorities, but you would have got the right level of hearing and their time. Whereas I fear many of us, we go in and we say, look, our BPM isn't up to scratch. We've got to change our process hierarchy. It doesn't work. And you've kind of, you look at those blank eyes and go, this person isn't understanding me. Well, actually, no, you're not understanding them. Right.
That's very good. And likewise, in getting buy-in from that executive level, or as well as getting buy-in from them, you also need to get buy-in from the frontline employees, the ones that you're making the changes to the work that they're doing. And in some cases, it would be work that they've been doing for the last 5, 10, 15 years. And if you're coming in to make some changes, then, you can't just barge on in and change what they're doing and expect for them to change and to adopt what you're trying to suggest. So how do you go about getting that buy-in from, the other end of the spectrum, the frontline employees, the people that are carrying out the process work?
Yeah. So the first piece of advice is respect that senior subject matter expert for who they are. Right. And remember, it's their process. It's not your process. And let me tell you a little story to emphasize the point. So if you're familiar with Rolls-Royce, as in the maker of the cars, and those airline engines, those big things that you see. So in the UK, the Trent engine is made in Derby in the UK. Okay. And there's a story of one of their workshops kept getting flooded. it was at the bottom of a hill, and the rain used to run underneath the door, and it used to get into a quite expensive piece of machinery and take the machinery out every month, a month or so.
Right.
Bunch of engineers, graduates turned up and said, right, we need to put in a really expensive solution. We need to drill. We need to cut a trench. We've got to put in really expensive drainage. It's going to cost us a few £1 million. It's going to take us 6 months. When can we do it? And the factory foreman kind of said, well, look, we're using this factory all the time. We can't take this particular machine down. Those engineers came back 2 months later to find that the factory had not flooded out at all. What had happened was the machine worker had actually realized that if he diverted the water at the top of the hill, it wouldn't run down the hill.
Right.
And some simple concrete and wooden boards, he'd actually fixed it. And one of the young engineers said to this guy, why did you spend all your time coming up with a solution? And this guy turned around and said, this machine put my son through college. His machine, his processes. Don't underestimate why he wants to work really efficiently and well. It's his machine, it's his process. Always treat him or her with the respect to start with. Don't just land and tell them we're going to fix it for you. Fix it with them.
That's amazing. That's great. And I think that they're also in the best position to feel the pain, understand the pain, and also identify areas for improvement or opportunities to improve the process or solve the problem that's happening, provide a solution to that problem. They're the ones that, they're either on the phone talking to the customers. They're the ones that are in the factory carrying out the work, that they've got the best, I guess, position to see what's going on and then what needs to be changed. And I think also that example of him changing the flow of the water at the top of the hill, I feel like that's a great analogy for probably a lot of processes where instead of trying to, spend millions of dollars or spend significant amounts of money and time at one section of the process, it actually could be fixed if you try and find what's the root cause of this problem, and how can we fix this problem before it blows out and requires all of this excess.
Absolutely. Fix the problem at source, and don't bother trying to fix the stuff downstream if upstream is broken. That's
amazing. Yep. That's great. Now, for that person that is listening right now and they're learning a lot about, how, I guess, the value that an organization can receive from understanding, managing, improving their business processes, working with the different stakeholders and things like that. What are some of the objections that they might face when, I guess, approaching their organization or approaching the senior leadership about understanding or improving or solving problems through process improvement? What are some objections that might arise that they'll have to be, I guess, prepared to respond to?
Yeah, as adults, we have a culture of firefighting.
Right.
And we often like to be firefighters, which means having broken processes, which means I can fight the fires caused by those broken processes. Sometimes I'm really comfortable in that state as a firefighter. So part of the answer to your question is, what type of culture do you want your organization to have? Mm-hmm. Do you want a firefighting culture? Do you want a very variable organization where you're not quite sure what results you're going to get?
Right.
Or do your customers need a bit more stability and you're okay having a culture of continuous improvement? Mm-hmm. And it's that culture question that drives where some of those objections are going to come from.
Right.
Having worked in organizations that did have a culture of continuous improvement, these were not the questions that were asked. These were not the problems that people came up with. They didn't ask the why, they asked the how.
Right.
How are we going to fix it? Not why are we going to fix it?
Right.
And your Toyotas of this world, they're in the how. They don't say, why are we going to fix that safety problem on that car?
Mm-hmm.
They don't even have those conversations. They just say, how are we going to solve it?
Right.
And what I would say is, don't underestimate, if you're an organization that does not have a culture of continuous improvement, it does not have a culture that encourages improvement, then there are the type of models that are out there that you need to have a look at. The best one I use is Shingo. For those of you familiar with Shingo, because Shingo is more about culture than it is about tools.
Right.
And Shingo would talk about, ideal results are driven by ideal behaviors. If you do not have the ideal behaviors, you're not going to get the ideal results.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd very much encourage organizations out there or practitioners who are not familiar with models like Shingo to go and have a look, because when they're in place, organizations make sensible choices about improving their processes,
mm-hmm.
and they make silly decisions about not improving them.
Right. Now, looking to the future of, I guess, the BPM landscape, over the last 5-10 years, technology is rapidly evolving and changing. And as we have talked about earlier in this conversation, organizations will jump at automation and jump at various new technologies. We're seeing RPA, robotic process automation. We're seeing process mining as well. These different technologies, but looking to the future, so the next 2, 3, 5, 10 years even, where do you think organizations, and we may have even already touched on it, but where do you feel that organizations should direct their time, effort, energy, and attention towards when it comes to understanding and managing their business processes? And I will say, obviously, that every organization is at a different maturity level. So different organizations will require different things at different times. But what do you see over the next 3, 5, 10 years?
So first of all, if you don't understand your customer journey and you don't understand your customer experience, don't bother messing with your back of house processes.
Right.
So go there first.
Yes.
And today, if you don't know what your customers need and want, you're in danger of going out of business right now, because your competitors do know.
Right.
And if your competitor is automated, if your competitor is digitized, they can change very quickly.
Mm-hmm.
They can change channel, they can change product, they can change pricing strategy far quicker than you can even imagine.
Right.
So first of all, if you haven't got your customer journey and experience understood, go there first. Behind there, just realize that if you are a BPM practitioner and you don't like robotics, tough.
Right.
Because senior stakeholders do. Because senior stakeholders, you get a good return on your investment if you put in process robotics well and correctly. And consumers don't like paying more money. Consumers like paying less money. That's the reality. Mm-hmm. So organizations will be more automated. There will be robotics. It's up to us practitioners to get over that if we don't like it and get on that bandwagon really, really quickly. However, don't misunderstand that robotics doesn't equal empathy.
Right.
Robotics does not gauge customer empathy. It does not gauge what customers are thinking and saying. A human hearing and human thought does.
Yes, right.
So in terms of our organizations, there is more place for the human in terms of those value add customer moments, those key moments of truth, and let the standardized, repeatable transactions happen in the background using technology.
Right.
And those organizations who can't afford that technology, you won't be around in the 5 or 10 year horizon that you suggested.
Right.
Have done it.
Yes. Okay. And speaking about BPM practitioners, and it's been a very turbulent year for a lot of organizations and for a lot of people as well. Apart from understanding robotics and I guess the value that brings an organization, what I guess advice would you give BPM practitioners that maybe are maybe either they're out of work at the moment, or maybe they're still employed, but they do need to think about the future and I guess be prepared for the changes that potentially or will definitely come. It's just what changes are going to be happen. So what would you recommend or advise those BPM practitioners for the future as well?
Yeah, there's a few key things. So first of all, if you're a hard skills BPM practitioner, you need to rethink your toolkit.
Right.
Because those hard skills can be automated by robotics in the future. Your soft skills can't. So if you don't think your soft skills are as good as they can be, pivot into that learning and development. That's for sure. Mm-hmm. If you are like many of the practitioners out of work or in a role that you don't actually want to be, don't underestimate the tidal wave of work that is coming.
Right.
All these organizations that switched off projects wholesale. The bank that I'm at, one of the top 4 in Australia, they had 160 major programs of work. They cancelled all of them overnight down to 20. Now that's massive. Now that tells us 2 things. Were those 140 really important? Maybe not. But that bank thought they needed 140 projects to go and solve something. Those things still need solving. When these organizations fire up again, as they're starting to do, certainly in Australia, now that we've got the virus under control and the economy's picking back up, this demand will come.
Right.
But these organizations are now looking for agile thinking practitioners.
Okay.
These organizations know that they could switch off their work offices and switch on people's homes in a matter of weeks using an agile approach.
Right.
So you need to be agnostic in your approach. Your toolkit needs to cover many different things. You know, if you're a BPMM 2.0 expert, then you need to do an agile course,
right,
and vice versa. And then the last kind of piece of advice is think about what we've done, our human needs during COVID. We have needed to collaborate and communicate in a different way. We've needed to do it digitally. We've needed to do it on a screen. Organizations that are out there looking for you will expect you to be able to do that seamlessly.
Right.
I unfortunately get to interview a number of practitioners who, because they haven't been in the workplace, they don't know how to use Zoom. They have their camera set up the wrong way. You know, these organizations expect you to be able to communicate with them in the way that they communicate with each other.
Yes.
So learn those collaboration tools really, really quickly. Mm-hmm. And the last piece of advice is don't expect these opportunities to come to you.
Right.
I talk to tens, if not hundreds of individuals a week reaching out to me. Hey, Gary, what about this opportunity? And I go, that's fantastic. And I spoke to someone the other week and I said, how many on-spec conversations have you had with recruitment agencies, or, you know, you've sent in CVs to organizations that don't have adverts? They've gone, none. I'm waiting for work to come to me.
Right.
That is not what's going to happen.
Mm.
The world has changed.
Mm.
You've got to be out there. You've got to be collaborating, and you've got to be communicating to be noticed.
Yes. That's great. That's fantastic. And last point on, I guess, learning more about business process management, because there would be a number of people that are listening today that, you know, that maybe they've heard of business process management, but it's a new concept for them. It's a new idea for them, whether they're at a lower level within an organization or whether it's an executive that's listening right now. obviously there's a lot of information out there. You've got the internet, but for a lot of people, that can be quite overwhelming, because it's like, well, what do you search for, and where do you look, and which resources do you trust? And, everything you read out there, it's not going to be applicable to your current scenario and your current organization. So, where next? What should that person that wants to learn more about process management, where would you encourage them to go to?
Yeah, look, there's a bunch of associations out there. Some of them not for profit, some of them small membership fee. So as an example, I'm the treasurer of the Australian Association of Lean Six Sigma Practitioners. We've managed to keep going during COVID. We don't charge a fee currently. We just hold online events for people to learn and ask questions. Organizations like that are out there. Udemy is a really cheap way of dipping your toe in the water to learn something, to find out it's interesting or not. So as an example, you can learn Python coding. You can spend $10. You might not use that, or it might not be interesting, but you've only spent $10. And if you do like it, it might be the best $10 you've ever spent.
Right.
I think trying it is probably what you've got to do. And if you're a hard skills practitioner, learn the soft skills. And if you're a soft skills practitioner, learn some of the hard skills, so that you can talk about some of the real problems of implementing a tool from a practical perspective, not just the person perspective. There's a lot out there, but if you're not increasing your learning now, you never will.
Yes.
Because now is the time to up your skills, because there are many candidates out there cleverer than me, smarter than me, and for me to be considered, I've got to up my game as well.
Right. That's great. So Gary, obviously we can only fit so much into a 45 minute conversation. We can only scrape the surface on a number of topics, but I think the real win here is that the people that are listening or viewing this conversation, they'll be able to, even if they just take away one thing that they can, that sparks a conversation, that encourages them, that points them in the right direction or helps them take that next step. I think that's an absolute win in my mind. So I think, this conversation today has been really valuable. And for the guys that are listening, if this conversation has sparked further questions, I encourage you to, reach out to the various associations, jump onto Udemy. And if it's okay with you, Gary, to reach out to Gary, to connect with him and ask him follow-up questions around this conversation and what you need to be thinking about, I guess, to bring value to your organization or what you're doing. So Gary, I just want to thank you so much for giving up your time for us today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Daniel. A pleasure. And season's greetings, everyone.